and welcome back to Imagine Live from Ericsson, where we take a close look at the future of limitless connectivity and invite you to share your thoughts live. Now, taking action to achieve net zero right now is more important than ever. We only have a narrow window of opportunity to keep the increase in temperature within 1.5 degrees centigrade. What role does the telco industry have to play in addressing the climate crisis? Well, let's have a look. So let me tell you how today is going to work. I have two esteemed guests, experts in the industry, who are helping me figure out what we can do as the telco industry. And you have the opportunity to ask them questions. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And please do contribute. Ask any questions that you want, and they will come to me, and I'll be able to ask them on your behalf. Already, we have people joining in from Taiwan, from Libya, India, Brazil, Vietnam, UK, Kenya, USA, Yemen. Welcome to you all, and welcome to everybody else. We would love to hear from you over the next 40 minutes. Now, to help me dissect this very important issue, let's welcome our esteemed guests. First, Stephen Moore has worked on climate action for the last 15 years and is responsible for the Climate Action Program at the GSMA, the Mobile Industry Association. The association unites more than 750 mobile operators with almost 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem. And Stephen, I also understand that you are a keen but frustrated balcony gardener. Is that right?
Fair to say, yeah.
What do you grow on your frustrated balcony?
At the moment, not a lot. there's a lemon tree out there that's struggling to survive, so I think I need to bring that inside.
Oh, lovely! That's going to smell delicious around the beginning of the year. Well, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you. Our other guest is Emily Olander, and she is the Climate Action Program Manager at Ericsson. Emily is responsible for meeting Ericsson's net zero climate strategy and program objectives and maintaining its leadership position in this area. But apart from that, Emily, you also have a keen interest in four-legged friends. I believe you have a horse by the name of Jax.
Yeah, Jackie. So it's actually Jakarta, but I thought Jackie Chan is a really fun name to have right on a horse, so I'll stick to that.
I love it. Please do. Our audience, I would love to hear your amusing pet names. I've had a few in my time. Well, welcome to you both. Let's start with that recent COP27 summit. And I'd like to start with you, Emily. What would you say are the major successes and the failures of this year's COP from your point of view?
Yeah, I think if we just go back a bit more, I think, the failures of COP in general, of course, is, failing to reduce emissions globally. I think the conference of the party, the climate conference, as we talk about today, is to mitigate climate change. We know we need to keep the 1.5 degree ambition alive. It's actually a limit, not really a target. And I think that became apparent more in the communication lines during this COP. And coming into this year's COP, based on the national determined contributions that the countries have. So basically the pledges the countries say that we can do up to 2030 will actually be an increase in emissions by, I think, almost 11%, so 10.6%, which basically means that we have failed, right? We are not reducing emissions aligned with science, halving by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. So coming into that, it was, of course, a hard COP for Egypt to manage. But I think what they did well was to implement a bit more talk on nature-based solutions, the role of nature, and then also this loss and damage fund that they actually clubbed through. And before we knew actually that we didn't think it will come through based on a chief negotiator from a country. So I think that was, of course, a success. But then you can always discuss if that will divert the focus of mitigation action, and then it will actually increase the need for money to loss and damage fund. We don't know how it will be operating. And of course, failing to deliver the money for the Green Climate Fund by, I think it was $100 billion per year. And that was supposed to be done already 2020. And I think they managed it this year, so 2 years after. I think it's, of course, you start a question of how will this loss and damage fund be done? But I think at least it was a major milestone for them. And I think we need to cheer them on that.
Stephen, what do you think should have been done but wasn't?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge we faced coming out of the back of the negotiations was the pushback on 1.5 degrees, which was strengthened last year as part of COP26, and we saw this phrase included in the end text around a phase down for coal. There was hope that could be expanded to all fossil fuels, to phase down fossil fuels in the end text for COP27. That didn't happen. There was a different terminology that has allowed potentially gas to be included, and we know that that's not really the answer. Gas as a transition fuel is not the answer to rapid decarbonisation. We need to focus investments on renewables. So I think it's, we saw big pushback from the petrostates, from the likes of Saudi Arabia, from the likes of Russia, that didn't want to have this language included. And I think this is kind of what we're up against. And I think there was such a need and a requirement to have this loss and damage fund set up. It's been pushed for 30 years. And I think we can't underestimate the role of Pakistan actually in helping make that happen, because they came in and just pointed out the floods that have happened over the course of this year. They're not at all responsible for climate action. If you look at historic emissions, Pakistan has barely contributed historically, but yet their significant proportion of their country was underwater as a result of human-induced climate change. So I think that did help play a big role in getting that loss and damage fund through. I mean, the question is going to be, will the funds be there for it? But it's also meant that the 1.5 degrees is teetering on the brink. And I think we're going to see that be a much bigger focus going into next year for COP28, whether there is any chance of keeping global heating to within that 1.5 degree limit.
Emily, these are some big goals that were established this year at COP. And I'm wondering what Ericsson's first step is in trying to meet some of these goals, and perhaps some of the things that Stephen pointed out were not quite established in paper, or certainly in headlines.
Yeah, I think one really, I would say, even though we see some failures from national government, I think what COP really had established is the role of businesses, and that actually has grown. I think I started my first COP back in 2016, just after the Paris Agreement, and it's been exploding by the number of corporates who are there actually trying to take a commitment. And I think for a company like ourselves, we need to be there and show the way forward. So we are working with the industry associations and with GSMA. We're working with Science Exponential Roadmap Initiative to follow our targets to the science trajectory. So really keeping the 1.5 degree ambition alive. So what that means for us is we need to halve our value chain emissions by 2030. And it's not about actions later. about actions now. So we need to have targets within the whole organization, and they need to be implemented. They need to be owned by people within the organization. And then we have set a net zero target by 2040. And here it's important that we do the whole decarbonization of basically 90% of the whole value chain emissions, not any offsetting. And we need to do for like the 10% who is left, we need to do neutralization efforts that then goes to this, it's called like for like emission reduction. So it's basically if you would have those 10% of emissions, and then they will come from fossil fuel emissions, for example, sources like oil and gas that Stephen was talking about, you cannot offset them according to the normal standards. You need to permanently reduce them because they have a carbon cycle that is so long. So you really need to permanently take them out from the atmosphere. But if you would have biogenic emissions, you can then use nature to neutralize those. And I think that will be a key focus going forward to get those statements from from the whole business that if we follow net zero, we need to follow these standards and do it in the right way. Otherwise, we can't make those claims, and then you will have a greenwashing statement again, and we will not see the action we need to globally.
We actually we have a follow-up question from Carrie G in California, and I'm gonna throw this over to you, Emily, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Stephen, from the broader the broader industry. What are the largest carbon emitting sectors that should be tackled first? And are there any solutions that Ericsson is providing to these sectors' existing systems to reduce our carbon emissions?
Great comment and question. Awesome. I think the largest sectors that also Ericsson is focusing in within our business is we have, of course, energy, transportation, and I would say industry then that also includes, for example, manufacturing. And I think the energy transition is, if we tackle that, I think we can do a lot of things. And I think here we have connectivity who really can support with the high speed that is needed for actually getting more renewables into the grid. And if you don't have digitalization and our technologies, you can't have a grid that is fluctuating as much when you have renewables, because there is a shortcoming of actually putting more renewables into the grid. And I think we need a digitalized, smart energy grid system to do that as well. When it comes to manufacturing, really reducing emissions there, optimization is needed otherwise, and also looking into, I think also close to the heart of Stephen, circularity, like, digitalization solution is the things that we can actually reduce that resource impact, reduce the impact from that. So I think we have many solutions. I can't go through them all, but we know collectively that if you look at for up to 2030, legacy portfolio from ICT sector could reduce, have the potential to reduce emissions by 15% by 2030 on global greenhouse gas emissions. But then if you add new technologies like 5G, IoT, AI solutions, you can maybe increase that to 5%. And that with the Ericsson research, and I know that also DSM may have some other enablement effect research as well. So I think the potential is big. We just need to implement it correctly and do it at a scale that is needed.
Yeah, Stephen, what's on your list for the telco industry?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the things that Emily's mentioned. The kind of coming together that we're seeing of the energy sector and the transport sector. I think that does present a huge opportunity for greater efficiencies and also for more renewables on the grid. So, we're looking to go towards a system where we're going to have a much more renewable electricity on the grid. It will be intermittent in its generation, but it will be predictable. So it'll be a question of balancing the peak demand with the generation capacity, and electric vehicles give us an opportunity to do that, because each electric vehicle will be effectively a store of energy, and they can help us actually balance the grid. If you send customers the right price signals for when to incentivize them to charge their vehicle at certain times and not charge it at others, that can help us move towards a much lower carbon grid. So I see that as being a great opportunity of the use of connectivity. And also the area of precision agriculture. So this is where we use connected drones, where they can actually much more closely target fertilizer and pesticide use on fields. And there are some promising trials that have shown that this could make huge reductions in the amount of pesticide and fertilizer that is used. Obviously, though, the biggest thing that's going to reduce our agricultural emissions are changing our diets and moving towards more plant-based and lower carbon sources of protein. But again, there's lots of innovation that's happening in that space at the moment as well.
Stephen, I want to move over to something that Emily alluded to before, and I think it's an important part of sustainability in business, and this is this idea of the circular economy. Can you explain a little bit about it and how businesses can implement in order to create actual lasting change?
Yeah, absolutely. So the concept of a circular economy is that we move away from a more linear take out the ground, manufacture, use something, then literally we throw it back into the ground. But creating a more circular flow of materials and products. So keeping products in use for longer can have huge benefits. If we look, for example, at the life cycle carbon emissions of a mobile phone, about 80% of those carbon emissions happen before you've even taken the phone out of the box. So, for every extra year that we can keep a mobile phone in use, extending that lifetime, and then, slowing down the rate in which we have to make whole new phones is one aspect of it. But recycling existing phones is also really important, making sure that those materials and components that we're taking out of phones that can no longer be used, that we're using them and putting them back into new phones. And measuring things like the level of recycled content in a phone, which we're starting to see some manufacturers do. So Apple has recently announced that across its entire product range, it's using about 20% recycled content. And they have an aspiration to use more, which is great. So, it's looking to see and identify those companies that are pushing ahead with a circular economy strategy. Samsung has recently announced a circular economy strategy as well. And there are huge benefits. So we, in a recent strategy paper we published, focus on mobile phones, we found that if everyone in the world held onto their phone for just 1 year longer, it would be equivalent to taking 20 million cars off the road. So a huge potential saving there. And it's cheaper. It's cheaper for people as well. It's cheaper to repair your phone than to buy a new phone. So there's a financial saving for people. And then there is a social impact as well, because we know that a lot of phones that end up in landfill, particularly in countries in Africa, we've seen certain e-waste mountains in places like Ghana. And we see open waste burning, which is extremely hazardous to human health. And we see actually even children being involved in that sometimes. So, we have to come up with a much more tightly closed system for e-waste management. And we need to use these materials into making new devices as well. But there's huge benefits if we do so, environmental, social, economic benefits as well.
These are material cells, and they can be pretty hard sells to the end user. Emily, from a business perspective, thinking more about the less material, but thinking more about the digital elements, what can the digital technologies and the digital systems offer businesses as they seek to achieve net zero?
I think that's a good question. And just reinforcing what Stephen said as well, I think if you haven't been on a landfill where they do it's in internal combustion because it's just taking fire itself, like the smell of that and seeing those people, like I've seen them in the eyes, and some of them do not have hope. They are basically dead inside, and I think it's the worst things I ever seen in my life. So I think it's the waste situation is really horrible in many places, and I think all countries can improve on that sense as well. And I think for digitalization, I would say, is one of the keys of actually improving circularity. But we also need regulation. I think if we don't get that and support from governments, we will have a burdensome process that would actually minimize the potential of actually, for example, in our products, take them back and recycling the amount of materials that is needed. We have a quite high potential, 98% recycling potential of our products, but the 2%, it's also having important metals as well. So you need a profitability of doing those improvement as well, both in the recycling business, so you can get that value out. But we need the material, because looking into Ericsson, 140 years of business, if we need to sustain ourselves for 140 more years, we need to have the material for that. And we need to also change the ways we do business and thinking about that. And I think after we talked yesterday, I thought quite a lot about that. You know, we really need to looking into how companies are evolving into that sense. And I think we see that more and more for businesses. And we have a few cases that, you know, yesterday we talked about the music industry, of actually how through digitalization you democratize the whole system, you reduce the need for resources. We don't have CD players anymore, we don't have CD records. You actually have it digitalized on demand with less consumption. And I know that many of you maybe think that we have quite a lot of emissions within the ICT industry, but looking into it, it's only 1.4% of the global total emissions, and that is included electricity for data centers, etc. So the impact of what you, for example, do for music industry now, it's so much less. And I think digitalize even more can, of course, then help reduce the material impact of other sectors.
Yeah,
I
Stephen,
guess we're still a little bit in transition.
Oh, please go ahead.
I was going to say we're still a little bit in transition. I've just realised that I've got DVDs sitting on the shelf behind me.
Oh my God, no way.
We are in transition.
Maybe not,
but
really
this is the thing, right? Business transition takes a long time. Consumer transition takes a long time. What we're talking about is such a large issue, such a conceptual issue that has both the material and the social and all of the different, you know, commercial impacts, that it needs to be tackled from somewhere. Stephen, how to encourage transformation, business transformation within the telco industry to achieve net zero? Is this a top-down thing? Is this a bottom-up thing? Is this a carrot thing? Is this a stick thing? How would you recommend to the people that you represent that they transform in a way that is going to achieve such a remarkable transformation?
I think it's all of those things, you know, top down, bottom up, from the side, sounding a bit like a dance now, carrots and sticks. I think what we found is getting very high level support from an organization, you know, right from the very top, a public commitment to a net zero target, to a science-based target, you know, that really then helps set the agenda for the whole of the organization. And once you've obviously made a public commitment, you know, companies work really hard to be able to achieve that. And that's something that we've seen has been hugely successful across the telco sector, in that I think we have more than 50% now of the sector that's committed to rapidly reduce emissions by 2030. And that's not just their own emissions of the company, that's the whole value chain emissions. So it's both upstream in the supply chain and downstream with customers. So we're seeing companies really take on board. These are completely voluntary targets. Nobody's forcing them to take on these targets. And they're really, really ambitious. And are already driving a huge amount of change. I mean, I think a lot of things that is not necessarily that public at the moment, but a lot is being worked on behind the scenes. We work on a number of different projects with our members. The GSMA set up a climate action task force because in 2019 we set an ambition as an industry to be net zero by 2050, and we wanted to collaborate with our members to do this, to achieve this. And there are now more than 60 members as part of the task force, and they are, mobile network operators operating in almost every country around the world. So I think it's getting high-level buy-in, public commitment. It's also collaborating, and that might be collaborating with your competitors. I mean, many of the companies that we work with are part of the task force. They're competitors, but they're united in a common goal, and they have these common challenges of reducing their whole value chain emissions. And we can work very closely with our suppliers. So, for example, with Ericsson, who's a huge supplier to the industry, but also is incredibly progressive in what Emily and colleagues are doing at Ericsson, and that really helps because the supply chain is actually a really, really enormous part of our footprint. So yes, I think collaboration is really important, but just getting people enthused and excited and giving them hope. We can do this. I think there's a campaign that's running at the moment, which is literally that phrase. We can do it, and we can. But people are really keen to work together on this. So lots of different ways.
There are options. There are many options. And one of the things that was mentioned earlier was mitigation. And we have a question in from Christine L. on LinkedIn. How do you think, and this is to you, Emily, to start, how do you think technology can help things like climate adaptation?
That's a good question as well. But I think I just wanted to say an example first, connecting to what Stephen said, which I think was really great. And from Ericsson point of view, I was just reflecting when you said it, what have been different if we only did the 2030 target, except only in comparison of doing 2040 and then 2030 as well? Because what we did was we went to our executive team and said, we want to set a net zero 2040 target. And they're like, ooh, that's really hard. Can we make it? And then we got our biggest hardware supplier unit to actually look into this. Can we make the 2030 target happen? Can we maybe manage the net zero? And when they started to think about that and work on that, we suddenly got a companion. It was not only sustainability anymore, we really came across to the organization. And when they took the ownership of this, we saw something really, it was an important transformational shift. And after that, it's actually been running quite smooth, because it's always hard to decarbonize. But, getting that across the organization, which I'm so grateful. And all of a sudden, we have so many more sustainability people within the organization working with that. And I think that transformational change is something good. So sometimes it's good to put those daring goals, because then you actually change something in the organization. And then for what technology is looking in. Yeah, sorry. What's it?
No, please go ahead. This is your show.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, and then as we also talked about COP and more in adaptation. And I think what is really close to a lot of our hearts is nature. So firstly, I think the focus on nature-based solutions, that is really one of the biggest opportunities we have into also not only for our benefit, but also really into climate adaptation is so hugely important. And it's not only about doing that the old school fashion way. And I think technology is really putting a potential and opportunity that we haven't seen before. As Stephen said, we have precision agriculture, and you can even expand it. You have sensors in the soil, actually monitoring how the soil is managing. And we have our old school project, the connective mangroves, that I basically started back in 2015, using sensor to monitor the water level, the salinity, the pH levels, and water increases. So you actually would know when you should plant the mangrove saplings, and then we could increase the survival rates from 40% to 80%. Just by using sensors, like quite a small scale technological sense. You have a platform monitoring that, and then you know what you need to do. But then we scaled it. We put in AI that we could actually also, together with machine learning, can see who is coming into the area, how the tree is doing. Do we have any intruders? What type of birds do you have on the scene? And we could actually find a bird that hasn't been seen in the area. They thought it was extinct in that area. So it was really cool that you get technology to support our way of increasing more resilient nature ecosystem that also will help us in adaptation. Because as we know, for example, mangroves is a really great flood protection measures, and also, for example, for tsunamis or other storms, those are really I would say the protector of coastal ecosystems as well, not only to humans, but also to fish, etc.
Well,
we have a lot of cases,
that,
but that was just one. Yeah.
Well, actually, you answered Ben Ward's question. He was asking about the Connected Mangroves project. So I'm delighted that you touched on that. It is a super, super interesting project. Stephen, I want to move beyond the individual organization because this is where every person can take action. And there's always a danger with these types of global conferences that they can attract a lot of attention, right? And then they fizzle away. Then they disappear. They slip into the background again. What can we do beyond the individual company level to encourage and move towards net zero?
So beyond individual companies, do you mean as a sector or as individuals or?
As individuals. As individuals.
As individuals. Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there are some things that we can do as individuals, but actually a lot of what we need to have happen is actually at a kind of broader system level. So there are individual things that you can do in your own lives. So switching to renewable electricity, having some form of that where you live, if you're able to actually install it, if you own the place where you live or you have control over it, changing our diets, changing the way that we travel to lower forms of carbon, cycling, walking, sustainable forms of travel, probably the biggest things that you can do, and less consumption of things, or using more, tapping into the circular economy, reusing things, recycling things, buying secondhand. But I think we're now moving also to the point where we need to encourage more change, more systemic change to happen. And that actually means that we need to get a little bit political, to be honest. We need to engage ourselves more in the political process and support change happening at the level of it might be your local council, it might be your local city, it might even be just your community, or it might be at a national level. Because one of the things that we are not seeing happen sufficiently fast enough is governments taking this on board and treating it like a climate catastrophe. We're just not seeing it. The scale of change that we're not seeing, the pace of change that we're seeing, just does not signal that it's being understood as a catastrophe. And I think the only way that we're going to be able to change that is to push policymakers to do more, to act more quickly. And we know that there is widespread support for climate action. And this is not just a Western thing, this is in all countries around the world. There is an understanding by the general public in almost all countries that climate change is happening, that it's real, that will have negative impacts, and that we need to take immediate action. That's pretty consistent, talking about more than 50% going up to close to 100% in some countries. So we have the public support and consensus to do this. And I think it's about, one of the biggest things that we can do as individuals is push policymakers to act faster. And so that we have more progressive outcomes than we had at COP27. We need to have a much more progressive outcome for COP28 next year. Absolutely.
Well, I have a question here from Laura F. from Spain, and she really taps into this idea of systems. The system that she's focusing on here is transforming the energy systems. What is your take, she asks, and I'm going to ask you, Stephen, on the implementation and the time it will take to transform completely?
Oh, that's a big question. I think it will vary from country to country. I think each country will have to plot its own decarbonisation pathway for, energy transition pathway for their grid. We have lots of legacy power stations. Take a country like France, for example. It has a large number of nuclear reactors that are still in operation and will probably need to have their lifetime extended. But there are other countries the UK, for example, has some of the biggest offshore wind reserves in the whole world. We've been a leader in offshore wind actually in the UK. So I think there is huge opportunities for countries to focus on those renewables that will work best for them. Now, some countries have fewer renewable energy reserves than others. And I think we're also seeing a big opportunity for, transboundary connectors between countries, even some that go really quite long distances. So there is a project actually planned for Morocco, which is going to make use of, Morocco has tremendous wind resources because it has an Atlantic coastline that's very windy, and it also has tremendous solar resources as well. And I think there's a project planned for a pipeline from Morocco all the way up to connect with the southwest of the UK, because the energy that Morocco can generate, particularly in the winter, very well balances the energy requirements that we'll need in the UK during that time. So I think each country will have a different energy transition plan. How quickly can this be achieved? I think we could see many countries going 100% renewable electricity within the next 10 years. But it does take a huge amount of leadership at a national government level. And sort of referencing back to the electric vehicle piece that mentioned before, that I think that will also be an important ingredient in helping to switch away from gas, for example, and having a completely electrified both transport system, but also for buildings as well, and moving away from fossil fuels for heating buildings as well. So I think all of these things can come together, but governments do need to be a little bit visionary about this, and they need to put the right incentives in place. But the great thing is that we're already seeing renewables are some of the cheapest forms of energy that are available now. So we need to continue to invest in those. And we also need to take away these fossil fuel subsidies that exist that are making renewables artificially more expensive in some countries. It's not a level playing field everywhere. But hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think you raised something earlier that I want to bring back to here, which is this idea, particularly for the general public, who are the end users of so much of this, is this idea of predictability. And that's something that needs to be implemented in an infrastructure point of view, which is not necessarily something that I personally can do, right? And so I think it's a multi-dimensional systems problem that we all need to engage in. And to that end, Emily, I have a question here from James Brisbane in Manchester. Climate change is a global problem. What would be your suggestion to the younger generation? And specifically, is there a way for them to associate with Ericsson and make an impact?
Oh, great question. I think what we've seen now, the youth engagement around the world, leading with Greta Thunberg, I never thought that was possible. If you have said that 10 years ago, I thought, being an activist is not the way you change the world. And they have certainly changed the way youth are operating, and you see engagement in, for example, now we have a lawsuit of 600 Swedish young people who are getting a lawsuit together and suing actually the Swedish government for not, also this one, but the previous ones, for not actually supporting the climate targets that we have, and are not making it possible for them to have a better future. And I think that this is just one case of many, and that engagement is really something that you can tap into. But I think you have the power as the youth of choosing those companies you want to work with and for. So, for example, as Steven said, if you need to consume, you also can choose the right company you need to consume for. But the one you're choosing to work from, like looking at all the ethical aspect, is not only climate action. I think other things is also really important when you choose that. And for Ericsson, of course, we have a lot of engagement with universities and even back in schooling, trying to educate on ICT improvements, etc. But we also have this called Ericsson Innovation Award that runs every year, where innovators from the universities can come together and tackle societal problems. We have climate change a few times, and I think this is really a cool concept. I will actually be the moderator for this year's final award, which is going to be amazing. And we have 3 really good finalists, and that's something I think it's a way of engaging with a good, both the technology aspect, but also solution, like how can we scale those solutions, because we have quite many on the market, but you need them to scale, and then you also need engagement. And I think we can have that. And the Ericsson Innovation Award is one of them, which I think is really cool. So check it out.
I want to round up this morning, whatever time it is that you're watching, with a question for both of you. And I'm going to start with you, Steven, and then I'm going to turn to you, Emily. Could you please give me 2 examples of positives, 2 examples each of positives that we can focus on, and how that can round us out in a hopeful way as we attempt to move towards our net zero objectives? Steven.
Oh, 2 examples of positives. So I would say my 2 examples would be the kind of levels of, to touch a little bit on Emily's point, the levels of activism and support that we're seeing, particularly from younger generations, but it's from kind of all the way through. That really gives me hope for the future, because, they really get it, and they understand that their future is at stake, and that we need to act quickly. So that's probably the first thing. And then the second thing I would say is on the technology development. So on the innovation that's being applied, the research and development that are going into these areas. And I think we've only just beginning in that space. I don't think, if we look at all of the money that's being spent on research and development in the world, we're still only spending a very, very small proportion on trying to tackle the climate crisis. So I think there's a huge opportunity to spend much more. If we've already got this far with what we're spending, imagine what more we could achieve if we were to really focus our attention on it. So I think those 2 things, the kind of will, but also the fact that humans are we're the most innovative species that's ever existed on the planet. So, and we can put that to good use, and we are putting it to good use.
Emily, briefly,
it's hard to come after.
It's hard to follow that one, isn't it? I know you can do it.
Oh my God. But I usually also say that I think this is not only something negative. I think we have an opportunity to evolve, right? I think we see the evolution of the human history is that we want to evolve. We want to become a better society. And this is the opportunity to make it right, even though it's a few hundred years too late. And I think one idea that I usually try and say is that money talks. So it's for you as an individual person, looking through what you can do, firstly, privately with your funding, that actually has a potential. So either what you buy, but also what type of pension funds you have or stock market companies you have in your portfolio. I think those can really trickle down because you put a requirement out there on the market, which is really important. And we need that across. And if you then work for a company or in a treasury department or finance, you can make that transition already now. And Ericsson had just started that journey. And I think we can expand that even more. And we are trying to look into that so we get a whole financial system transformation. I think how we are looking into climate targets and funding and I think that's really something cool that we can tap into more. But then also I would like to say what you do politically. I think even though Steven said it, I think it's really important. We need to change the governments now because the companies are soon there, not all of them, but the national governments need the support in this transition.
Thank you both. This has been so fantastic. I have enjoyed the conversation so much, and our questions from our audience today has been amazing. So Steven and Emily, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who helped steer our conversation by sending in a question. On Twitter alone, we had more than 825,000 people tuning in. So thank you to you and also to the folks who are on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. Achieving carbon neutrality on time is clearly the greatest challenge facing the world. And I think that what we've heard today is a sign that connectivity delivered by the telecoms industry can play a massive role in meeting our commitments. So let us keep the faith. If you have enjoyed this broadcast, please do keep commenting and sharing. And we will continue to explore connectivity when we meet next. Join us on the 6th of December when we will be taking a close look at extended reality, XR, and how it might transform all of our lives. We live in such interesting times. I will see you all again in December.